Chapter 7. Proper Desperados. The drought, which had gripped the northeast section of the state for much of the summer, broke during the night, and by morning the rain had changed the long driveway into a sluggish, dull red river. Fletch knew he should feel grateful for every drop, but as he trudged down the drive, holding a large umbrella unsteadily above his head, he was less than joyful about the weather. Muddy water rushed by in a frothing torrent, splashing across the obstructing rocks in a red spray. The dreams of the night before still lingered, but they seemed jumbled and confused. The young man, John, at the bottom of the well. Had there been something about silver? His hand taking a slice of apple, then brushing across the head of a snake. In the darkness before daybreak, Fletch had lit the oil lamp and taken his journal from the desk drawer. Something is happening, and I don't understand it. I've met a boy I really like. I think there may be a ghost in the yellow room. I'm having nightmares about the wolf and the 3 little pigs. What else? Ever since the accident, there are times when things go out of focus. I'm not afraid, but my body acts as if I am. I get dizzy and breathless, and sometimes I feel like I might throw up. And sometimes I see things in my imagination, and I feel like I'm looking into the past or into another kind of place. The blood running down the tree at the gospel singing. Then in the weed garden I could hear voices, like people singing from a long way off. These things are like the dreams I remember from being in the hospital, which for some reason keep coming back into my mind almost every day. One of those was the same, people singing. I think the song was Land of Rest. I know it's night because I can see fire and moonlight. Then there is the one about the stone houses, like a village built into the side of a cliff or a mountain, but not quite like pueblos. In that one I hear a bell ringing above me, and the stone streets follow the curve of a wall. What else? In one there is a stream with steep reinforced banks. The water moves slowly among stands of tall reeds, and the place smells fresh and cool. I think there is just one more, the small waterfall with the frog on the wet stone among the ferns. The thing is, now I'm seeing these places even when I'm awake. Sometimes they're so clear I feel like I could step right through, and it would be like waking up from a dream and finding myself back in the real world. It's raining outside now, and I'm so sad I don't know what to do. I miss my mom more than anything. Just as he had become resigned to standing by the highway until the school bus came, Silver's pickup appeared at the top of the hill. It turned into the drive and slid to a stop. The mud-spattered window rolled down. "Hey there, Christopher Robin," Silver called. "Where are you going with that umbrella? It's a beautiful day." He leaned over and struggled with the passenger door. "Get in. You're going to school, aren't you?" "If I don't drown first." Fletch slogged up to the truck and climbed inside, trying to get the umbrella closed in the process. "My boots are pretty muddy." "That's okay. Now the inside will match the outside." He spun out of the drive, and mud clattered beneath the fenders as they picked up speed on the highway. The windshield wipers batted ineffectually at the downpour. "Where's your dad? Couldn't he drive you?" "Had to visit a friend of his in prison down in Jackson. He'll be gone all day." Silver looked over at him. "You seem sort of downhearted this morning." "It's the weather, I guess. Whole world feels mucky." Silver nodded. "It'll get better this afternoon. Just watch and see." Fletch's boots stuck to the floor mat, and he pulled them free, leaving a lattice of mud. "I think it's the rain mostly." "Maybe so. Guess you have to learn to like it." When they drew near the school, he parked the truck at the beginning of the dirt road, which led around the back edge of the baseball field. Nearly a quarter of a mile of falling water lay between them and the main building. "Why are we stopping way out here?" Fletch asked. "It's time for your first lesson," Silver replied. "Out." "Not on your life," Fletch told him. "You can walk if you're on such friendly terms with the weather." He still believed Silver was teasing when he bound up his umbrella and snapped the tie. Then Silver opened the door and stepped out into the rain. For a minute, Fletch huddled on the seat in consternation, beginning to realize that Silver was not going to get back in. What's more, he had the keys to the ignition. "This is crazy," he shouted, flinging open the door of the truck. He leapt out into the rain and started to make a dash for the building, but Silver grabbed his sodden sleeve and held him back. "Walk," he ordered. "It's just water. It doesn't hurt." Rain poured through his clothes, through his skin, soaking into his bones as if they were made of soft stick candy. He stole a glance at Silver's face, considering the merits of breaking away from him and running for shelter. Silver seemed amused by his distress. "Rain is fun." With one hand firmly gripping his wrist, the other twirling his umbrella in a Gene Kelly pantomime, he led Fletch slowly to the shelter of the breezeway. The downpour cut off abruptly, thundering on the metal roof. bravely born," said Silver in admiration, tossing the rein from his hair. Evidently he hadn't yet realized they would both be ruined for the rest of the day. "I can't go to class like this," Fletch yelled, laughing. "We're drenched, you crazy idiot. Drowned." Silver thought for a moment. "Tell you what," he said. "I've got a spare sweatsuit in my locker at the gym. You can put that on. And don't panic, we can run this time if you like." They darted out into the rain again, splashing through the stream where the path between the wings had been. Reaching the gym, miserably wet and out of breath, they slogged back to the locker rooms and tried to make themselves presentable. Fletch found it strange, but rather delightful to be wearing Silver's clothes. No one guessed they were not his own, which made them seem like a secret, but he half wished someone would recognize them as his. They were comfortable, and they smelled of him. The gray morning made it difficult to breathe. Third period was interminable. The sentence diagrams looked unbalanced, so he drew trellises to prop them up. He added tooth marks to his pencil, capped the end with a new eraser from the plastic pouch at the front of his notebook. Inside the back cover, he wrote a secret message in block letters, which he ran together so that no one would be able to decipher them. The letters evolved into a stone wall, and he planted a tree on top of it, the roots spreading down into the earth beneath. A few lines suggested fields beyond the tree, and in those fields he found air enough to breathe. As Silver had predicted, the rain ended soon after lunch. As the world outside grew brighter, the classrooms seemed to draw together in resentment, jealously hoarding what was left of the morning's gloom. During the break following fifth period, Fletch found Silver, and they went out to visit the sun. It had turned into a magnificent afternoon. The sky was clear and open. Everything gleamed, and the scent of rain lay on the long grass like remembered laughter. They lingered on the breezeway, unwilling to re-enter the dark hallway. "We ought to cut out early," Silver suggested. "See the woods after the rain." He swung languidly around one of the support poles. Fletch looked at him, suddenly wary. "You mean just sneak out? I've got to go to study hall. So do you, for that matter." "Fletch, you ain't got to do nothing but die. And we don't have to sneak. We just go by your locker, pick up your stuff, and head down to the gym to get our clothes. Then we hop in my truck and vanish." The idea was both frightening and appealing. "Isn't that a serious offense? Punishable by death or something? What if we get caught?" "We explain the situation, confess our inexcusable guilt, and get hauled in to see Mr. Sellers. He'll give us a stiff penalty for propriety's sake, but he'll also understand. For a principal, he's quite enlightened. Believe me, Fletch, in order to investigate life, you sometimes have to cut class. It's one of the laws of nature. The bell for 6th period rang out almost directly above them, shattering the spell. I don't know, Silver. I'm sort of meek and mild about taking chances like that. Better to stick by the rules. Silver shrugged. Safer, maybe. But the more you allow people to control where you are, how you act, and what you think, the more they'll pat you on the back and tighten down the screws. Rule number 1 is submit, and that's okay as long as you choose to submit, but it doesn't even occur to most people that they have a choice. He swung around the pole, eyes dancing. But don't come along just because of what I say. That's just an exchange of obedience. Perhaps if Fletch had been wearing his own clothes, he would have made a different choice. But already he had absorbed some of Silver's recklessness. He felt like Tom Sawyer about to embark on one of his illicit adventures. He could even sense that old devil Mark Twain whispering, "Go for it, you young fool." He went for it. They blended with the press of people in the hall, using them for camouflage. "Here we go," said Silver softly. "Proper desperados. But there's Mr. Sellers. Act natural." Fletcher's legs promptly iced over. He felt giddy, hardly able to meet the principal's perceptive gaze. "Silver Kendall, just the man I was looking for. You have study hall this period, don't you?" Silver's smile seemed effortless. "So I've been told." The principal nodded. "That's what I thought. How about keeping an eye on things for me for about 15 minutes this afternoon? Mrs. Ross had to leave early, and I've got some things to do before I can come in and cover it." Silver's mouth dropped open. Fletcher's tonsils threatened to take wing. Mr. Sellers laughed. "Don't worry, I'll be in to take over as soon as I set things in order." "Sure," Silver managed. "I'd be happy to." After the principal had disappeared, Fletch sank against the wall. "Desperados. Proper desperados. Who do we look like, Frank and Jesse James?" Silver gave him a sheepish smile and dug him in the ribs. Compromise is sometimes necessary. The pastorium gave Fletch no trouble for the remainder of the week. He and his father replaced the steps on the back porch and installed a washing machine in a little room between the kitchen and the back stairs. During this project, they reopened the well, which lay beneath the floor. Being accustomed to city water, Fletch had not considered that the pastorium might have a well, or that it might be under the house itself. Now fitted with an electric pump and copper pipes, the well had originally been a rope and bucket affair, the water drawn up by turning a windlass, made from a log and an iron rod. Later, a hand pump had been installed at the kitchen sink. Fletch took a flashlight and directed the beam down the shaft. In spite of the recent rain, the well was still not completely full. Out of curiosity, he tied half a brick to a ball of twine and lowered it into the water. When it finally came to rest, he drew it back up and measured the length of the string. 28 feet of water, with room for about 10 more. The well reminded him of how many mysteries this house held, some intriguing, others frightening. And there were other mysteries beyond the house itself: the forest maze, the orchard well, the sickle hidden in the barn. "Dad, I want to find out more about that boy, Jarrett Harbor." His father stood up and mopped his face with a handkerchief. He folded it up and tucked it into the pocket of his overalls. Then he looked at Fletch, frowning slightly. "I figured you might ask about him sooner or later." "Well," said Fletch, "if there really is a ghost in our house, I ought to know as much as I can about it, don't you think?" Mark nodded. "I understand your curiosity, all right. Honestly, I don't know all that much about it myself. And what I do know, well, it isn't pleasant. Sometimes the past is like a wound. If it's been healed, it's bad to reopen it." Fletch wasn't to be put off so easily. But if Jarrett's a ghost, some kind of restless spirit, that means the wound never healed in the first place, Dad. It just got covered up and forgotten. That's probably true enough, his father agreed. I suppose you've got a right to know about it, and you're old enough to handle it, I reckon. Was it that bad? Pretty bad. Mark went into the kitchen and got a Coke from the fridge. He handed another to Fletch. Jarrett killed children. Girls. He drowned them in a swamp back in the forest. I've forgotten how many. Fletch stared at him. I thought he killed some men with that sickle I found in the barn. That's right. They had found out about the murdered children. Caught him with one of the bodies, as I remember. He killed 3 men, I think, before he escaped. That's seriously creepy, all right. His father nodded. There's something more. Jarrett had a sister named Millie, who later had a daughter named Ophelia. Ophelia had a daughter named May, a beautiful, resplendent girl who was your mother. Oh, no. Mark nodded. You remember Millie. You met her once a long time ago. Millie was black. Jarrett was black. The girls he killed were white. Fletch stared at his bottle of Coke. He wasn't sure he could speak. A feeling of shame, almost of guilt, seemed to have clogged his throat. I know I told you that Jarrett escaped into the woods and was never found. That's what I was told myself. But honestly, I kind of doubt it. You see, Fletch, nothing happened afterward. I mean, the law didn't pursue it. No one in town spoke about it. The matter was just dropped. That makes me think it was taken care of the way such things were often taken care of back then. I don't understand, Fletch spoke softly. But even as he said the words, he knew they were untrue. They did find him? I think they probably did. And I think they probably lynched him. Fletch forced himself to meet his father's gaze. You're right. This is bad. Worse than I expected. But I'm glad you told me. It was, 1905 maybe? The South was a different place back then. Assembly was an interracial community even during those years, but events like that can tear families and neighbors apart. Jarrett's crimes were horrendous. I sometimes wonder if I'd lived back then, if I wouldn't have lynched him myself. That weekend, Fletch went with his father to visit Josh Avery, who was recuperating at home, but still unable to work. Doc Merritt had left a bottle of tonic and a jar of liniment on the table by his recliner. "Liniment's all right," Josh told them conspiratorially, "but that tonic's really all right." To Fletch, the man looked lost without his greasy cap and worn-out boots. Mark had just about gone through his supply of broken arm jokes when Florence Avery called them to the den for refreshments. Fletch was about to follow his father, but Josh spoke up from the bed. "You been out in them woods much, boy?" "Yes, sir," Fletch nodded, "near about every day." He told him about hiking the logging roads with Silver, and when he mentioned that his father had said something about a swamp in the area, Josh looked up sharply. "I hunted rabbits all over that swamp when I was a boy," he said slowly. "Fact, I got stuck in there one time and like not to got out." He coughed and grimaced, adjusted the angle of his recliner, and frowned. "I knew better, you know, but I wasn't thinking. I'd killed a rabbit, a big old buck rabbit, and when I went in to get it, I stepped out onto this slough. The mud had dried on it, and it looked real safe, like a dry wash bed, sunk in clear up to my waist." He grinned weakly. "Had on a pair of rubber boots. Them suckers are still down there somewhere. Anyhow, I worked my way forward and grabbed hold of a bush and pulled myself out. If I'd panicked, I'd likely still be down there too, stuck inside them boots." Josh paused and looked at Fletch seriously. "Don't never go down there, son. Don't never go back in that swamp, because there's things in there that—" He stopped and looked uneasily toward the door. "I just wouldn't go in there. Ain't no telling what the hell a man had run into down there now." "You mean snakes and stuff?" "Snakes?" Josh breathed a curse, then paused for emphasis. "There's wild cows in there." "Wild cows?" "Shoot, yeah," he grinned. "They used to come up those trails back of the old plantation just looking for trouble." "Well, I'll watch out for them. I'll find a tree to climb." Josh gave him a level stare. "Boy, are you stubborn or what? You keep out of that swamp, you hear me?" He was silent for a moment, then continued in a lower voice. "There's graves back there in the hills around it, Indian graves. There's things in the trees, and there's one place was like hell to the Indians. Back in the early days, the mud there used to be hot as fire. Bill Weathers, he went back in there one time when we were kids. His folks looked for him all day, couldn't find him. Then he come home that next morning all bloody and covered in mud, and he wouldn't say a word. He never said a thing about it until the day he died. I don't know what he saw back in there, and by God, I don't want to know. But boy, it marked him for life." Josh slipped back, exhausted. "Now don't you go bothering Florence with any of this. She's no outlander, but there's a good bit she don't know. But I know. Ain't nothing in that place got a speck of good in it. Even that rabbit I shot was bitter as mud." Fletch stood there, trying to think of something to say to calm him. Eventually, he promised to stay clear of the swamp, but he knew that first thing on Monday morning, he'd ask Silver what he knew about the place. His dreams were about the swamp that night, beginning with a formless image of shadow, huge and dark and very old, caught beneath the weight of years and the crushing pressure of stone. He was lost among meandering stretches of water, hunting steady ground. Finally, he reached a sandy area clear of vegetation, save for a few stunted trees. Ahead lay a pit of smoking bluish mud, which bubbled and spattered like a cauldron. There was a noise like the groaning of mountains, a deep, booming snarl of sound, incredibly dark and wild. The sound terrified Fletch, yet he responded to it against his will. At his feet, something thrashed and wriggled in the slime. A girl, black with mud. Only her teeth were white, and they looked very sharp. Fletch woke up, feeling ravenous. Something to capture the whippoorwills. Doc Merritt swirled the tip of the shaving brush in the pottery mug he kept on the washstand and lathered his chin. 30 years before, the brush had belonged to young John, an old man from Ocala who had come down to Assembly several times each autumn with a truckload of apples to sell at the co-op. Young John always stayed overnight at the mill. Doc remembered a time when he had been about 5 years old, riding his tricycle between the mill and the co-op, filling the basket on the handlebars with bright red apples, which he took home and heaped into a huge pile on the kitchen table. When his grandfather discovered what Merritt had been doing, he loaded the basket back up and ordered his grandson to take the apples back to young John. "He has to sell those apples to the outlanders, Merritt. That's how he makes his living." Doc drew the razor gently along the curve of his chin. The scratching of the blade cutting through the stubble became the sound of dried herbs crushed in a mortar. The bathroom became the cool cellar of the mill, with its flagstone floor, its walls of stone and hand-hewn logs. A pot of tea, fragrant and comforting, waited to be poured into china cups. Fresh leaves and roots lay in small heaps on the table. Young John picked up a sharp knife with a worn wooden handle. "What are we making?" Merritt asked the old man. "Something to capture the whippoorwills, or at least the sound they make." Young John sliced a pale root into thin slivers, arranged the pieces on a saucer, and added a few drops of golden liquid from the oddly shaped bottle, the white glass as thin as spun sugar. "Now we leave it for the night. Come morning, we'll add some moonshine for suspension. Bottle it and pack it away." Merritt nodded, not altogether comprehending. "What about the whippoorwills?" "Listen." The old man nodded toward the open window. Merritt's eyes lit up. "I can hear them." He looked out of the window into the gathering darkness. "Can we put in the lightning bugs? You know, fireflies?" Young John nodded. He put his hand out into the night air and began to sing. "Shine, little glowworm, glimmer." A firefly landed on his outstretched hand. Young John drew it inside and took a small brush from a cup on the table. He brushed the firefly over the saucer as if grooming it. "Twilight in Assembly, summer of 1952. You'll want to remember that for the label." Merritt looked over at the small bottles of colored glass waiting to be filled. Only one of them would contain the results of the evening's work. "How long will it last?" "Depends on how often you use it. Maybe 50 years. If you're careful, maybe 100. 100 years? I'll be dead by then." "Maybe. But I'll tell you what will happen. One day, all those years from now, somebody in Assembly or Ocala or some other community will open this bottle, and you and I will both be in there, because we were here tonight." Merritt was silent for a moment. "So it's kind of like heaven." Young John nodded. "This one's pretty close, I reckon. There are others not so close. You'll likely run into them one day, and if you do, it's best to leave them be." There were other bottles on the shelves. Some of them had labels in English, some in languages he didn't know. Each label also bore a curious symbol, depending upon the part of the world from which it had come. A tree with spreading branches, a hand with the fingers held apart, a curving labyrinth, and, for those captured at Assembly, 3 joined circles. "Something's turning," Merritt said. "A brush in a cup?" Gazing into the washstand mirror, Doc decided it was time to go down into the cellar and retrieve the bottle he and young John had placed there so long ago. Mumblety-Peg. Susanna Nelms watched for the troll at the bridge by the mill every morning as she walked to the school bus stop on Rowan Street. It was never in the sunlight, but kept to the shadow of the overhanging bank. She had first noticed it earlier in the summer, about the time of her dream about the pig's foot, and now she caught sight of it almost every day. Usually the bridge by the mill was ordinary, but every now and then it was a covered bridge. The covered bridge never stayed for long, and Susanna saw it so seldom that she had begun to think it was in a different place altogether. Maybe that was where the troll had come from. She never called down to it, never let anyone else know it was there, but sometimes it tried to speak to her. The sounds it made were like the choke and the gurgle of a clogged drain, and at first she couldn't understand anything it said, only that it wanted something. Susanna had tossed pebbles over the edge of the bridge, then buttons and bits of colored cloth. Once she had left the last of a bottle of grape julep soda by the bridge, and it had disappeared. Memories, she found, were as good as objects, even better sometimes. It didn't matter whether the memories were good or bad, as long as they were sharp and clear. Using Daddy's shaving lotion, scared about the pig's foot, lawnmower cut up a snake. She never saw the troll attempt to walk, though it could swim and crawl a little, because sometimes it was on one side of the stream and sometimes on the other. What made her nervous was the thought that it might try to enter the mill, perhaps by clinging to the water wheel that came within reach of her window. Her mother often kept the window open at night. Susanna loved to listen to the creak and splash of the water wheel as she fell asleep, but she didn't like the thought that the troll knew her window was open. Bible school smell, she thought. Homemade Play-Doh. Last night, she had decorated a seashell with green and purple crayon and left it outside on the sill before going to bed. This morning, it was gone. It might have fallen off the sill, but Susanna didn't think so. Something else was there in its place. A bracelet of carved white beads, threaded into a length of discolored ribbon. Standing on the bridge, she looked over the railing into the tumbling water. No troll in sight, but it was down there somewhere. She could almost hear its thoughts. Something about a pocket knife. "Mumbledy-peg," said a voice in her head.